Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Let's get rolling. I just found out today, I should have found out 2 days ago, but the story, for some reason, got hardly any coverage. I just found out on the Democracy Now! Channel on YouTube with Amy Goodman. Phil Donahue died. I used to watch Phil on a fairly regular basis on the Phil Donahue show. Donahue. It was on for a long time. Phil was the originator, more or less, of the daytime audience participation talk show. He started the ball. He started it. The reason why his show was originally canceled was because when other people came onto the scene to compete with Phil, they were covering a lot of very, I guess you would say, sexualized content. Phil refused to go along. Phil wanted to talk about serious subjects like AIDS. He talked about AIDS all the time in a period when no one knew what AIDS was. He had debates on his show. Some people thought it was a virus. Other people thought it was something that you could get from sitting on a toilet seat. There was a lot of confusion about that subject. He openly had gay and lesbian people on his show at a time when no one else did that. But Phil did. Phil could. Phil got away with it because he was Phil. One time, one of his guests was Marlo Thomas, and I remember Marlo Thomas from her show That Girl. It wasn't a spectacular show, but it was cute. Marlo Thomas played opposite Ted Bessel, her boyfriend. And those were very innocent times. The two of them did not live together. There was no indication that they were having any kind of sexual relationship at all. Very, very innocent times. Different than now. When Marlo Thomas was on Phil's show, she made the comment, and I saw her say this on his show when it was first broadcast. Any woman would be lucky to marry a man like you. Phil looked astonished. The two of them began dating, and they remained married for the rest of Phil's life. A long marriage. Marlo was only 2 years younger than Phil. A long marriage. Marlo Thomas was the daughter of Danny Thomas, who was a celebrated comedian, actor from the 1950s and 1960s. He was very conservative. Phil was not. Phil was a progressive for his time. And yet, Danny Thomas and Phil Donahue became very, very close friends. They got along splendidly for as long as Danny Thomas lived. And I think Marlowe appreciated that. Their marriage was a good marriage. Not many marriages last that long, especially celebrity marriages, but theirs did. They genuinely loved one another. They cared for one another. Now, in terms of Phil's politics, they are not mine. Phil was a progressive. He was not a communist. Many people called him that, but people on the right have been calling progressives communists for my whole life and probably longer than that. But he was not a communist. I'm not even sure if I would call him a socialist. I do know that the reason why he was fired was because after the war in Afghanistan started, Phil opposed it. Phil opposed the war. He opposed it openly, critically on his show. Chris Matthews worked at MSNBC, was not very happy with that. At that time, Phil was hosting a show with Vladimir Posner, the Russian journalist, on MSNBC. Previously, he had hosted a show on CNBC, and then previously his show was syndicated. Chris strongly objected to Phil's presence on the air. And management listened to Chris. And they fired Phil. Now, I have nothing against Chris Matthews personally. I used to write him all the time. He would read my emails. I know that. Occasionally, he would respond to my emails on the air. I would comfort him when he would say things that were inappropriate. And I would say, Chris, don't worry, it'll blow over. And it did until the last time. And I did not write him that last time. I could not defend him when he made a comparison between Bernie Sanders and Adolf Hitler. Who could? And yet, Chris was allowed to resign better than what he did to Phil Donahue. So again, my politics are not like those of Phil Donahue or of Chris Matthews. I am much further to the left than either of them. And yet, I respected both of them. Especially, I would say, Phil Donahue. So I am mourning right now for Phil's death. Phil was not a third worldist, but I want to believe that if he had been aware of it, if he had known about third worldism, some type of third worldism, that he would have been at least sympathetic to it to a certain degree. I'm not saying he would have become one, but he would not have been closed-minded. Phil was a very open-minded man. Phil had a lot to be angry about. He was treated miserably, especially by Chris Matthews, but not only by Chris Matthews. And yet, he appeared to be at peace. I don't know if he held a grudge against Chris. I have no idea. I'm sure he was not particularly happy with him. Chris later claimed that he was opposed to the war in Afghanistan from the very beginning. That was a lie. That was a blatant lie. I don't know why he told it. Maybe he thought it made good TV. But the opposite was true. I remember Chris was a cheerleader for the war, while Phil Donahue was a cheerleader for ending it. The network did not want him. NBC did not want him. They were not happy with his anti-war speech. And so that ended Chris Matthews' career with his syndicated show, with his first show on CNBC, and his second show on MSNBC. That was the end of it. Chris never returned to television as a host once again. Never. So I am making this episode as a tribute to a man I genuinely liked. Phil could be annoying if you remember him. His way of speaking was annoying. He even annoyed me sometimes, but I looked past it because he was a serious television host. He was not like Sally Jessy Raphael, if any of you remember her. She put the daytime TV talk industry into the trash. And for that matter, believe it or not, so did Oprah Winfrey at the beginning. It wasn't until later that she pulled it out of the trash and made her shows more serious. I did not agree with her perspectives, but I was happy that she did that. In any event, for those of you that remember Phil Donahue, and I'm sure many of you do, if not, do a search under Phil on YouTube, and you will find many of his episodes. Do a search under Phil Donahue and Ayn Rand, and you will find two episodes that Phil Donahue did with Ayn Rand. What an odd couple. They did not agree on anything. Ayn Rand was aggressive. She was nasty, which was her style. She attacked a member of the audience once for asking a perfectly innocent question. Phil asked her, "Why are you angry?" And Ayn said, "That person had no right to ask me that question." Made no sense, but that was Ayn Rand. And Phil was still a gentleman. He did not attack Ayn Rand. He maintained his composure, and he lived out the rest of his life along with his lovely wife, Marlo, in Connecticut. Originally, they wanted to move into a part of Connecticut that was basically for old money and join an old moneyed country club. But the old money people who saw him as nouveau riche, new money, wanted no part of him, and so he could not do that. Regardless, I hope if you remember Phil like I do, and even if, like me, you thought that Phil was a progressive and not a radical or a revolutionary, which is true. That is a criticism I had of him then, and it is a criticism I have of him to this day. But still, he was a pioneer. He stood up for the LGBTQ plus community. He was in the forefront of the discussions on AIDS at a time when nobody else would dare to mention the subject. And so, despite his limitations, despite what I see as being his inadequacies as in terms of his politics, he still did an enormous amount of good for his time. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.